June 5, 1944. 23,000 feet above the English Channel, Flight Lieutenant James Thornton adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his instruments for the third time in 5 minutes. His Lancaster bomber droned steadily through the darkness, part of a formation that seemed absurdly small for what they'd been told was one of the most critical missions of the entire conflict. No bombs in the bay tonight. Instead, 8 tons of what looked like Christmas tinsel packed into bundles. Aluminum strips, each one precisely 11 inches long and 1.4 inches wide. The engineers swore these fluttering pieces of metal would blind the most sophisticated detection systems the German military had spent years perfecting. The crew thought it was madness. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What neither Thornton nor his crew could know in those tense hours before dawn was that their cargo of metallized paper strips would achieve something no amount of explosive tonnage could accomplish. The complete paralysis of coastal detection networks for 6 crucial hours, transforming the entire German defensive response during the most pivotal amphibious operation in history. The story begins not in the air, but in a cluttered laboratory in England 2 years earlier. Dr. Joan Curran, a physicist who'd been pulled from her university position, sat surrounded by rolls of aluminum foil purchased from local grocers. Her husband, Samuel, worked at the adjacent bench, both of them part of a team trying to solve a problem that was claiming hundreds of air crews every month. The German detection systems, officially designated Würzburg and Freya, could track approaching aircraft with uncanny precision, guiding fighters and anti-aircraft batteries with deadly accuracy. Joan had been experimenting with the reflection properties of metal strips for weeks. The principle was simple, almost absurdly so. Detection systems worked by sending out radio waves and measuring the reflections that bounced back. A large aircraft created a strong return signal. But what if you could create thousands of false returns? What if you could fill the sky with phantom aircraft, each one just as bright on a detection screen as a real bomber? The calculations were straightforward. A strip of aluminum, cut to half the wavelength of the detection system's frequency, would reflect radio waves almost as strongly as an entire aircraft. The German systems operated at wavelengths between 20 and 80 centimeters. Cut the strips to the right length, drop them in sufficient quantities, and you could theoretically create a blizzard of false contacts that would render the entire detection network useless. But there was a problem that kept Joan awake at night, sketching calculations in the margins of reports. If this technique worked for the Allies, it would work just as well for the German forces. Drop these strips over Britain, and suddenly the entire defensive network that had proven so crucial during the dark days of 1940 would go blind. It was a weapon that could be turned against its creator with perfect symmetry. For 2 years, the metallized paper strips, codenamed Window by the British and given the more prosaic designation Chaff by the Americans, sat in warehouses. Production had been authorized. Millions of strips had been cut, bundled, and stored. But the order to deploy them never came. The fear of retaliation paralyzed the decision-makers. Better to accept current losses than to hand the enemy a weapon that could devastate defensive capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cockburn, the scientist who'd taken over the countermeasures program, fought this decision with increasing desperation. Every week he compiled casualty figures. Every month he presented analysis showing how many air crews could be saved. By early 1944, he estimated that deployment of Window could reduce losses by 30 to 40%. That meant hundreds of men who would return home instead of burning in wreckage over occupied Europe. The breakthrough came not from his arguments, but from a shift in strategic reality. By spring of 1944, the German Air Force was in retreat. Fuel shortages plagued their operations. Fighter production couldn't keep pace with losses. The threat of massive retaliatory raids using Window had diminished to a manageable risk. And now, with the invasion of France approaching, the strategic calculus had changed completely. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, responsible for air operations during the invasion, reviewed Cockburn's proposals with new eyes. The planned amphibious operation required absolute air superiority. But more than that, it required deception on a scale never before attempted. The German High Command expected an invasion, but they couldn't be certain where or when. Every piece of false information, every misleading signal, every phantom threat would force them to spread their forces thinner, to second-guess their intelligence, to hesitate at the crucial moment. Window wasn't just a defensive measure anymore. It was a weapon of mass deception. The plan that emerged was audacious in its scope. 2 separate operations, each designed to convince German radar operators that massive invasion fleets were approaching at locations far from the actual landing beaches. Operation Taxable would simulate a fleet heading toward Cape d'Antifer, northeast of the real target. Operation Glimmer would create a phantom armada approaching Boulogne. Both operations would use the same basic technique, aircraft flying precise patterns while dropping window at carefully calculated intervals. Flight Lieutenant Thornton received his briefing on June 3rd. The operations officer spread maps across the table, tracing flight paths with his finger. Each aircraft would fly a carefully choreographed pattern, advancing toward the coast at exactly 7 knots, the speed of a naval convoy. Every minute, on the minute, crewmen would push bundles of window through the aircraft's flare chute. Each bundle contained 2,190 strips. As they fell, tumbling through the air, they would create a radar return identical to a large ship. The mathematics were precise and unforgiving. Fly too fast, and the illusion would collapse as the phantom ships raced across the detection screens at impossible speeds. Drop window too frequently, and the returns would merge into an obvious cloud of chaff. Too infrequently, and the phantom fleet would have gaps that would alert suspicious operators. The margins for error were measured in seconds and feet. Squadron leader Leonard Cheshire, who would lead Operation Taxable, gathered his crews for additional training. They practiced the patterns over the North Sea, night after night, until the timing became automatic. Navigator Pilot Officer Arthur Whitman developed a system using stopwatches and carefully marked charts. Every member of the crew had a role. The wireless operator monitored for recall signals. The bomb aimer, with no bombs to aim instead, served as the primary window dispenser, counting seconds between drops with metronomic precision. But the deception required more than just radar returns. Actual ships would accompany the phantom fleets, close enough to shore for German listening posts to detect their sounds. Small boats, each towing radar reflectors, would complete the illusion. And overhead, aircraft equipped with powerful transmitters would broadcast the electronic signatures of the naval traffic that would accompany a real invasion force. The preparation for these operations involved extraordinary attention to detail. Engineers calculated the exact rate at which window needed to be dispensed to maintain the illusion of a coherent fleet. Too much variation, and the phantom ships would appear to merge or separate unnaturally. The bundles had to be compact enough to push through the aircraft's chutes quickly, but loose enough to separate properly when they hit the slipstream. Factory workers assembled the bundles by hand, counting out the strips and binding them with soluble paper that would dissolve when exposed to the moisture in the clouds. Testing had revealed unexpected complications. Early trials showed that window could create such dense clouds of reflective material that it actually obscured legitimate targets. Aircraft flying through their own window trails became temporarily invisible to friendly detection systems. The solution required careful coordination of timing and altitude. Aircraft would drop window from high altitude, allowing it to spread as it descended, creating a broad curtain of deception rather than a concentrated cloud. On the German side of the channel, Fregattenkapitän Friedrich Witt commanded the radar station at Douvres-la-Délivrande. His crew operated a Würzburg Riese, the giant version, with its 25-foot dish capable of detecting aircraft at 70 miles. Witt took pride in his station's efficiency. They'd tracked hundreds of Allied aircraft, guiding fighters to intercept them, directing anti-aircraft fire with devastating precision. The equipment represented the pinnacle of detection technology, the product of years of research and development by the finest engineers in Germany. Witt's station was one of dozens that formed an integrated network along the coast. Each station communicated with its neighbors, cross-checking contacts, building a comprehensive picture of air activity over the channel. The system had proven remarkably resilient to previous attempts at deception. Simple diversionary flights were easily identified. Electronic jamming could be compensated for by adjusting frequencies or relying on backup systems. The network's redundancy made it difficult to blind completely. The operators at Witt Station were experienced men, veterans of thousands of hours watching the green glow of their screens. They'd learned to distinguish between different types of aircraft by the character of their returns. Heavy bombers created strong, steady signals. Fighters appeared as smaller, more agile contacts. They could estimate altitude by comparing returns from multiple stations. They could predict flight paths, anticipate maneuvers. In the technological arms race between detection and evasion, they believed their side held the advantage. On the night of June 5th, Witt's evening shift began normally. The operators noted scattered contacts, nothing unusual for a night when the weather had cleared enough to allow operations. Then, around midnight, something changed. The screens began showing multiple contacts, far to the northeast of the usual approach routes. The returns were strong, consistent, moving slowly but steadily toward the coast. Witt was called to examine the screens. The pattern was unusual. The contacts moved too slowly for aircraft, yet they appeared at altitudes far too high for ships. But there were so many of them, and they persisted, minute after minute. The young operator pointed out the formation. "It looks like a fleet, sir," he said, uncertainty in his voice. "A very large fleet." Other stations reported similar contacts to the northeast. Then came reports from stations near Boulogne, detecting another massive formation. Witt felt the first stirrings of unease. Two major fleets approaching simultaneously at widely separated locations. It could be the invasion, the massive amphibious operation that every member of the coastal defenses had been preparing for. But which fleet was real? Or were both real? A coordinated assault on multiple beaches. The reports cascaded upward through the command structure. Junior officers woke their superiors. Sleepy staff officers studied maps and situation reports. The returns on the detection screens were undeniable. Large contacts, dozens of them, approaching the coast at the speed of naval vessels. But something felt wrong about the formations. They were too precise, too consistent. Real fleets maneuvered, responded to conditions. These phantom ships maintained perfect spacing and speed. General Lieutenant Wolfgang Pickert, commanding anti-aircraft forces in the threatened sectors, ordered alert status for his batteries. Gun crews scrambled to their positions. Searchlight operators scanned the darkness, looking for the aircraft or ships that the detection systems insisted were approaching. But they found nothing. The darkness remained impenetrable. The silence was broken only by the distant throb of aircraft engines, too high to identify, too dispersed to target. Some of the more experienced officers began to suspect deception, but they couldn't ignore the evidence on their screens. The contacts persisted. They maintained formation. They advanced toward the coast with mechanical precision. Even if this was some kind of countermeasure, something was definitely out there. The question was what, and more importantly, what should the defensive forces do about it? Aboard his Lancaster, Thornton continued the precise pattern. His navigator, Flight Sergeant David Chen, called out the timing marks with the regularity of a metronome. "Window away," confirmed the bomb aimer, Sergeant Peter Morrison, pushing another bundle through the chute. Behind them, the metallized paper strips tumbled earthward, catching moonlight as they fell, creating a shimmering column that slowly dispersed on the wind. On German detection screens, each column of chaff appeared as a distinct contact, a ship-sized return that persisted for minutes before fading. The operation required perfect coordination across the entire formation. 18 aircraft for taxable, a similar number for glimmer. Each crew executed their part of the elaborate deception. They flew a precise pattern, advance 7 miles toward the coast, fly a circular pattern to maintain position, while the Phantom fleet caught up, then advance another 7 miles. Hour after hour, the pattern continued. Drop window, advance, circle, drop window, advance, circle. The monotony was mentally exhausting. Thornton fought to maintain concentration as the same landmarks passed below for the 4th, 5th, 6th time. His co-pilot, Flying Officer Robert Hayes, monitored the formation, keeping their position relative to the other aircraft. Any deviation from the pattern would create anomalies in the radar picture, gaps in the Phantom fleet that might alert German operators to the deception. Wireless operator Sergeant Michael Davies monitored the radio frequencies, listening for any sign that the deception had been discovered. Instead, he heard increasing confusion in the German communications, reports of multiple fleets, requests for reconnaissance, orders being issued, then countermanded. The carefully choreographed aerial ballet was working exactly as intended. But the deception wasn't limited to radar screens. Below the aircraft, a flotilla of small boats crawled toward the French coast. Each boat towed a sophisticated radar reflector designed by the same team that had developed Window. The reflectors, nicknamed Filbert, consisted of arrays of metal corners that created strong radar returns. From a detection operator's perspective, each reflector looked identical to a landing craft. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Mackenzie commanded one of the boats, a modified rescue launch that normally evacuated downed air crews. Tonight, his cargo was stranger than usual: electronic equipment, radar reflectors, and speakers that would broadcast recordings of ship engine sounds. The speakers, borrowed from a theatrical company, had been waterproofed and amplified. They played a continuous loop of mechanical noises, anchor chains, ventilation fans, all the sounds that would drift across the water from a genuine invasion fleet. The boats also towed barrage balloons, the same type that protected British cities from low-flying aircraft. The balloons served two purposes. They enhanced the radar picture, adding to the impression of a major naval operation, but they also explained the acoustic signature. German listening posts, straining to hear the sounds of engines, would detect the noise of the small boats and the diesel generators that powered the electronic warfare equipment. Combined with the radar returns, the acoustic evidence seemed to confirm the impossible. Two massive invasion fleets were approaching the coast. Group Captain Edward Fennessy coordinated the electronic warfare component from an aircraft orbiting at a safe distance. His aircraft carried Moonshine, a powerful transmitter that received signals from German detection systems and amplified them before retransmitting. The effect made each aircraft appear on German screens as a formation of multiple aircraft. Combined with Window, the electronic deception created a layered confusion that overwhelmed operators already struggling to interpret the bizarre returns filling their screens. Fennessy's navigator, squadron leader William Thompson, monitored the German frequencies with headphones that crackled with increasing desperation. The German operators were trying everything. They adjusted frequencies, searching for a clear picture. They cross-referenced with neighboring stations. They sent aircraft to investigate visually, but the phantom fleets persisted on their screens, tantalizing real, stubbornly refusing to resolve into either genuine threats or obvious false signals. At the German Naval Command headquarters in Paris, Admiral Theodor Kranke studied the incoming reports with growing frustration. The detection systems showed two major formations. Aircraft reconnaissance, hastily launched, reported nothing but darkness and scattered clouds. The few visual observations available described peculiar shimmering clouds descending from high altitude. One pilot reported what looked like snowfall, but metallically reflective. Another described curtains of thin material hanging in the air. Slowly, realization dawned on the more experienced officers. This was a deception. The Allies had somehow found a way to create false returns on detection screens. But even recognizing the deception didn't solve the fundamental problem. Behind this screen of electronic noise, where was the real invasion fleet? Because there was a real invasion fleet. While German forces focused on the phantom armadas approaching Cap d'Antifer and Boulogne, 5,000 ships and landing craft crowded the waters off the Normandy beaches, 40 miles to the west. The real invasion force, the largest amphibious operation in history, advanced through waters that the German detection network could no longer effectively monitor. The confusion extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. German military intelligence had been tracking the build-up of Allied forces for months. They knew an invasion was imminent, but the location remained uncertain. The German High Command believed the most likely landing site was the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. The Phantom fleets seemed to confirm this analysis, yet the timing seemed wrong. Why would the Allies announce their intentions so obviously? General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, faced an impossible decision. His reserves were positioned to respond to an invasion at Pas de Calais. Moving them to Normandy would take hours, perhaps days. If he moved them, and the real invasion came at Pas-de-Calais, the entire defensive strategy would collapse. But if he didn't move them and Normandy was the real target, the landing forces would face minimal opposition during the crucial first hours. He chose to wait, to gather more information. It was exactly the hesitation that the Allied planners had hoped to create. Every hour of indecision was another hour for the landing forces to establish beachheads, to unload equipment, to consolidate their positions. The Phantom fleets had bought something more valuable than territory. They'd bought time. As dawn approached, Thornton and his crew completed their final pass. They'd been in the air for 7 hours, flying the same repetitive pattern until their instruments seemed to blur together. The last bundles of window fell through the darkness. The Phantom fleet had advanced to within a few miles of the coast, close enough that German defenders should have been able to see ships, landing craft, the unmistakable signs of an invasion. But there was nothing there, just a few small boats now turning away, their mission complete. The exhaustion in Thornton's voice was evident as he confirmed the final navigation mark. His hands were stiff on the controls, his eyes burning from hours of focusing on instruments in the dim cockpit lighting. Behind him, Morrison's shoulders ached from the repetitive motion of pushing bundles through the chute. They'd dropped nearly 3 tons of window during the mission, bundle after bundle disappearing into the darkness. The sun rose over Normandy to reveal the truth. The beaches to the west, the beaches that the German High Command had considered less likely targets, were crowded with landing craft. Overhead, thousands of Allied aircraft dominated the skies. The detection systems, still recovering from hours of confusion, struggled to process the genuine signals mixed with residual window effects. At his radar station, Witt stared at his screens in disbelief. The Phantom fleets to the northeast had been illusions, elaborate deceptions created by physics and precise timing. But now, detecting the real invasion, his reports carried less weight. He'd spent hours reporting ghost ships. Why should headquarters believe that these new contacts were genuine? The irony was bitter. His equipment had functioned perfectly. The contacts had been real radar returns, genuine reflections of electromagnetic energy. But they'd been reflections from strips of metal, not from ships. His operators had done everything correctly, following procedures, reporting accurately what they saw on their screens. Yet they'd been deceived not by equipment failure, but by an understanding of physics that turned their own technology against them. The strategic impact of Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer extended far beyond the 6 hours of active deception. The confusion they created persisted throughout the critical first day. German forces, unsure which contacts were real and which were false, hesitated to commit reserves. The detection network, the technological backbone of the coastal defense, had been rendered unreliable at the exact moment when reliable information was most crucial. In the weeks that followed, Allied aircraft dropped window routinely during operations over Europe. The technique that had been feared for its potential to blind defensive detection systems became a standard component of electronic warfare. The German forces attempted to develop countermeasures, ways to distinguish real aircraft from window clouds, but each countermeasure prompted new deceptions, new techniques. The technological arms race had entered a new phase. Dr. Joan Curran, reading reports of the invasion's success, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her experiments with grocery store aluminum foil had contributed to the largest military operation in history. The metallized paper strips, so simple in concept, had proven as effective as she'd calculated. But she also recognized the broader implications. The age of electronic warfare had begun. Future conflicts would be fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with radio waves and deception, with phantom signals and technological countermeasures. For Thornton and his crew, the mission became a peculiar entry in their logbooks. 7 hours of flying precise patterns, dropping bundles of metal strips into the darkness. No enemy fighters engaged, no anti-aircraft fire, at least none directed at them. Yet their commanding officer told them, with unusual solemnity, that they'd played a crucial role in the invasion's success. The young bomb-aimer, who'd spent the night counting seconds and pushing bundles through a flare chute, struggled to comprehend how such mundane actions could have strategic significance. The full story remained classified for years after the conflict ended. Security officials worried that detailed knowledge of window techniques might compromise detection systems that continued to serve defensive purposes. Gradually, as technology advanced and new methods replaced old ones, the story emerged. Historians pieced together the careful planning, the precise execution, the hours of confusion that gave Allied forces the advantage they needed. The German officers who'd struggled with the Phantom fleets that night offered their own perspectives. Some maintained that they'd recognized the deception almost immediately, that the bizarre nature of the contacts had been obvious. Others admitted that the confusion had been complete, that for hours they genuinely believed two major invasion forces were approaching. All agreed that the technique had been devastatingly effective, achieving strategic surprise through technological means rather than military force. The legacy of that night extended into the post-conflict era. Electronic warfare became a recognized discipline, with specialists studying the physics of detection, the mathematics of deception, the psychology of operators trying to distinguish real signals from false. The simple concept that Joan Curran had developed in her laboratory evolved into sophisticated systems, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Overwhelm detection systems with false information, create uncertainty, force the enemy to hesitate at crucial moments. In the broader context of the Normandy invasion, Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer represented one component of a comprehensive deception plan. But their effectiveness highlighted a crucial truth about modern warfare. Technology created new vulnerabilities, even as it provided new capabilities. The German detection network, so sophisticated and effective, had been paralyzed by strips of metallized paper, each costing a fraction of a penny. The most advanced equipment could be defeated by the simplest countermeasures, if those countermeasures were applied with precision and intelligence. The aircraft crews who flew those missions dispersed after the conflict. Some returned to civilian life, carrying memories of the night they'd spent dropping tinsel over the English Channel. Others continued military careers, applying the lessons learned about electronic warfare to new challenges in a rapidly changing world. Few of them fully grasped at the time the historical significance of what they'd accomplished. They'd simply executed their orders with professional competence, maintaining the precise timing and patterns that the operation required. For the invasion forces landing on the beaches that morning, the electronic warfare operations overhead represented just one element of the massive Allied advantage in planning, resources, and coordination. They fought through intense opposition, suffering thousands of casualties in the first hours of the landing. But they fought without facing the full weight of German reserves, without confronting the concentrated response that might have driven them back into the sea. The confusion created by window and associated deceptions bought them time, the most precious commodity in any amphibious operation. Decades later, veterans of the Normandy invasion would occasionally hear about the deception operations that had supported their landing. Some expressed surprise that such simple techniques had proven effective. Others recognized immediately how crucial those few hours of confusion had been, how different the outcome might have been if German reserves had deployed immediately and decisively. The technical details of the operation revealed the extraordinary lengths to which planners had gone to ensure success. The window strips weren't simply cut to approximate lengths. Each bundle was weighed to ensure consistent performance. The soluble paper binding them was tested to dissolve at predictable rates. Even the packaging was designed to create the right acoustic signature when bundles were pushed through the flare chutes, a detail that seemed absurdly minor but contributed to the overall coordination of the air crews. The psychological impact on German forces extended beyond the immediate confusion. Once they realized they'd been deceived, doubt infected every subsequent detection. Was that return genuine or another trick? Should they scramble fighters to investigate, burning precious fuel on what might be another Phantom? The effectiveness of the detection network depended on trust, on the confidence of operators and commanders in the information it provided. Windows shattered that trust not just for one night but for weeks afterward. Allied intelligence officers monitoring German communications noted the cascading effects. Reports became hedged with qualifications. Commanders demanded multiple confirmations before acting. The tempo of defensive operations slowed as uncertainty became the dominant factor in decision-making. The Phantom fleets had created a fog of doubt that proved as effective as any smokescreen. The lesson that emerged from Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer resonated through military planning for generations. Victory didn't always require superior firepower or numbers. Sometimes it required superior information, or more precisely, the ability to corrupt the enemy's information. Make them uncertain about your intentions. Force them to divide their attention. Create hesitation at the moment when decisive action is required. The metallized paper strips falling through the darkness over the English Channel embodied these principles perfectly. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.